There is someone in your mind right now. You did not invite them there this morning. They arrived on their own, in the shower, on the drive, in the quiet space, before you opened your eyes. And no matter how many times you have decided to stop, the thought comes back. This is not weakness. Nothing about this means something has gone wrong with you. This is one of the most carefully documented patterns in 2,500 years of Buddhist teaching. A mind that grips another person long after that person has moved on, suffering entirely from the grip itself. Tonight, that changes. 5 teachings from the oldest Buddhist texts ever written, each answer a single question. Why does the mind refuse to release its grip on another person? And what does the Dhamma offer in response? These teachings were given to people sitting exactly where you are right now. They worked then. They will work now. Wherever you are listening tonight, in a quiet room in Manila, on a late drive in London, lying in the dark in Sao Paulo or Jakarta, you are welcome here. Make yourself comfortable. Let your shoulders settle and your breath slow. You have nowhere to be for the next 3 hours, except exactly here, exactly now. We begin with a young acrobat in ancient India, 60 feet in the air, performing for a village crowd, who had been carrying someone in his mind for years, without a single person ever knowing. His name was Ugasina, and from the ground he looked like a man completely in control of his life. 60 feet above a village marketplace, balanced on a bamboo pole, while the crowd below went quiet with the specific stillness that height and precision produce in an audience. He was the most visible person in the scene, and simultaneously, the most absent. His body was exactly where it needed to be. His mind was somewhere it had been living for 11 years, with a version of a woman who no longer looked at him the way she once had, replaying exchanges that had already happened and rehearsing ones that never would, sustaining something that had no existence anywhere in the actual world, except inside his own returning attention. No one in that crowd knew this. No one in the troupe knew the full extent of it. From outside, a man does his work reliably, travels the same roads, performs the same acts, with the same dependable skill day after day. From inside, a man can be living somewhere else entirely. The story of how Ugasina arrived at the top of that pole begins, as these stories often do, with a single encounter that rearranged everything that had previously felt settled. He was born into a merchant family in the city of Rajagaha, a prosperous place of commerce and established social order, where the shape of a young man's life was generally decided long before he was old enough to have strong opinions about the deciding. His family was respected and stable. His path was clear enough that it required almost no navigation. Learn the trade, take his place in the careful pattern assembled on his behalf, and move through his years within the reliable framework his family had spent generations building. None of this felt insufficient until a traveling acrobatic troupe came through Rajagaha and performed in the marketplace for 3 days. He watched from the edge of the crowd each afternoon, which was unusual for him. He was not a man who lingered at public performances. By the second day, he had stopped watching the performance and was watching one performer in particular, the daughter of the troupe's leader, who moved through the performance space with a quality he could not name but found impossible to stop tracking. She was skilled in ways immediately visible and present in ways that were harder to define. When the troupe left on the fourth morning, Ugasina walked out of the city behind their wagons and kept walking. He left a message for his family that offered no useful explanation, because he had none that would have satisfied people who had not felt what he was feeling. He followed the troupe until Rajagaha was far enough behind him that returning would require a deliberate decision rather than simply a change of direction. The troupe's leader received him without sentiment. The terms were plain. Every person in this company earns their place through what they contribute. If you want to remain, learn something worth keeping. If that proves beyond you, the road back is in the direction you came from. So Ugasena began learning the acrobat's art as an adult, which is to say, through sustained and frequently humbling repetition that offers very little grace at the beginning and progress in amounts too small to measure on any given day. Balance at height requires a quality of attention that cannot be forced and cannot be hurried, and the body's fear of falling does not negotiate. He fell during training enough times that the other performers developed a particular way of looking away, neither unkind nor encouraging, simply the neutral expression of people who have watched this specific stage many times before and understand that it resolves itself or it doesn't. He rose each time and tried again, because she was there, and as long as he was learning the work, he had a reason to be where she was. The years of repetition produced something he had not anticipated: genuine skill, good enough that the troupe's leader began assigning him the acts requiring the most control and the most dependability. The bamboo pole act became his particular specialty, climbing 60 feet, holding a position while the crowd below went completely still, then executing something precise and clean that demonstrated the height, was entirely intentional and not the result of accident or bravado. He became the person the troupe counted on for the moments when reliability was the whole of what was needed. Eventually, the troupe's leader gave his permission, and Ugasina and his daughter were married. There was a period afterward when everything in his life felt like confirmation that the journey had been worth its cost. He had wanted something that had seemed unreachable, had made himself useful enough to reach it through years of patient and unglamorous work, and had arrived. The warmth she showed him during those months felt like evidence that the entire arc of his life since leaving Rajagaha had been pointing somewhere real and worth pointing toward. He went to sleep those nights with the ease of a man who has come to the end of a long effort and found something genuinely good waiting there. The warmth did not remain. What happened between them was quieter than any dramatic account would suggest, and quieter things tend to be more recognizable because they are closer to actual experience. There was no single confrontation, no exchange that settled everything at once, no moment that could be pointed to afterward as the place where everything changed. What happened was that something in how she regarded him began shifting, gradually enough, at first, that he could persuade himself he was misreading it, then clearly enough that this interpretation became impossible to maintain without deliberate effort. The warmth receded, degree by degree. Then it cooled into something neutral. Then the way she moved through the space around him changed from something that included him to something that simply went about its own purposes, in which he happened also to be present. She had no reason to leave the troop. This was her family, her people, the only world she had known since childhood. He had no world to return to. Rajagaha had reorganized itself without him during the years of his absence. His family had arranged things accordingly, and the only skills he now possessed were the ones this troop had spent years teaching him in exchange for the work he gave them. They continued traveling together and performing together, sharing the daily rhythms of the same life, while something between them that had once been genuinely alive went quietly and permanently still. 11 years passed this way. From outside, Ugasina's life was unremarkable, in the way a working performer's life is unremarkable, competent, steady, causing no disruption to the troop's daily functioning. He was present at every meal, every performance, every dawn camp preparation, and every evening settle. The other members had no particular reason to look at him and suspect that anything notable was occurring beneath the surface of his reliable daily presence. What was occurring beneath that surface was a parallel life, invisible and constant, conducted entirely inside his own mind. He was carrying a version of her that he had built from the earliest months of the marriage and continued to maintain with extraordinary faithfulness through every performance, every shared meal, every quiet hour at the end of each traveling day when the troop fell into its separate silences. In that interior life, he replayed specific conversations with a fidelity that made them feel present, not the conversations as they had actually unfolded, but versions of them in which certain words were different, certain responses more tender, certain silences filled in ways that had not actually occurred. He rehearsed alternate paths from pivotal moments. What might have followed had he said one thing rather than another? Had he noticed something earlier? Had he acted with a clarity he had not possessed at the time? He maintained a version of her that still looked at him with the particular recognition she had briefly offered, and he returned to that version the way a man returns to a lamp in a dark room, not because the lamp is warm, but because it is the only light available. He was not always aware this was happening. Some of it occurred in the visible gaps of the day, the minutes before a performance began, the long hours on the road between villages when the troop traveled in its separate clusters and conversation was sparse. Much of it ran beneath the surface of everything else, a low and constant current of attention directed at the construction, while his hands did the ordinary work of his life, and his face presented nothing unusual to anyone watching. This is one of the things people rarely understand about the grip. It does not require your full attention to sustain itself. It runs on partial attention, on the fraction of awareness that goes unoccupied during the ordinary conduct of a day and it becomes so habitual that the returning feels less like a choice and more like weather, something that arrives without requiring permission. 20 feet away, the actual woman went about her actual life. She performed her routines with the same skill she had always possessed, spoke with her family members in the easy shorthand of people who have shared a small traveling world for many years, made practical decisions about the ongoing logistics of life on the road, and continued to change in the small, daily ways that all living people change. She was a real person, present and continuing, but Ugasena was not watching her. He was watching the version he had assembled, the one frozen at the precise moment the warmth left, held in that particular state for 11 years by the consistency of his returning attention, sustained not by anything she was doing, but entirely by what he continued to bring to it. That version never left, because that version had nowhere to go. It existed only within his own mind, had no capacity to evolve, or age, or surprise him with anything he had not already supplied it. The replayed conversation, the imagined exchange, the grief that arrived at the same interior places each morning to check whether anything had changed overnight, all of it was fuel he was providing himself, daily, in amounts he had stopped noticing, because the providing had become so constant and so automatic. On the day the Buddha arrived at the village where the troupe was performing, Ugasena was already at the top of the pole. The crowd had gathered in the marketplace below, as crowds do when a troupe arrives with its promise of something worth watching. He had climbed to his position 60 feet above them, as he had done hundreds of times before in hundreds of different villages, and he stood there, practiced and still, waiting for the signal to begin his routine. His body was exactly where it needed to be, controlled and ready. His mind was where it had been for 11 years. The Buddha arrived at the edge of the crowd and looked upward. The Udana, one of the oldest collections of the Buddha's teachings, preserved across 25 centuries, records what followed without ceremony or setup, in the direct and spare language of a moment that required no elaboration to be complete. The Buddha looked at this man 60 feet above a dusty village marketplace and spoke to him as plainly as if they were sitting across from each other in a quiet room with nothing between them and no one else present. "Let go of what is in front," he said. "Let go of what is behind. Let go of what is in the middle. With a mind that has gone beyond clinging, you will not come again to birth and aging." 4 sentences. No introduction, no context established, no permission asked, no preamble to locate either speaker in the scene or prepare the ground for what was coming. Just the teaching, given plainly in the open air of a village marketplace to a man balanced on a pole who had been carrying an invisible interior life for 11 years, without a single person in his daily world ever knowing the full weight of it. Something broke open in Ugasena at those words. The Pali Canon records that he attained liberation in that encounter with the Buddha, before reaching for the full weight of what liberation means in Buddhist teaching. stay with the more immediate truth of what actually shifted in him as those 4 sentences arrived. What broke open was a recognition, sudden, complete, and carrying the particular quality of something that had been sitting in plain sight all along, but remained hidden until this precise moment about what he had actually been holding for 11 years. He had not been holding her. Across all 11 of those years, he had been holding something he had assembled from his own materials and maintained with his own sustained and largely unconscious attention, a version of her constructed from memory of who she had briefly been toward him, from imagination of who she might still become under different circumstances, from desire that had nowhere left to arrive, and so kept circling the construction instead, from grief that had been returning to the same interior places so consistently that it had become structurally indistinguishable from how he experienced his own daily life. This construction had required nothing from the actual woman to keep running. It had never required anything from her. It needed only one thing: his continued returning to it, his continued treating of it as the real thing, his continued supplying of attention to something that existed nowhere outside his own mind. He had been supplying that attention every day for 11 years, while she lived her actual life 20 feet away, completely independent of what he was maintaining. He descended the pole. The Pali Canon records a brief exchange that followed between him and the Buddha, precise and settled, the record of a man who has just seen something he cannot unsee and is checking carefully that he has understood it correctly. What the troupe noticed afterward was something quieter and harder to put a name to. The man who had spent 11 years performing 60 feet in the air while his interior life was entirely elsewhere had arrived, perhaps for the first time in those years, fully at the place where his feet were actually standing. This was perceptible to them without being nameable. The person who descended and walked among them was present in a way the same person had not been present before, not dramatically altered, not visibly changed in any way that could be pointed to and described, but there in the quiet, thoroughgoing way that a person is there when their attention is no longer divided between the world they inhabit and a construction running continuously somewhere inside them. Now, consider what the teaching reveals about the grip itself, what it is made of, and what keeps it running. When the mind cannot release someone, it is almost never holding the actual person. The actual person is living their life, changing in ways you cannot track, making choices you cannot anticipate, continuing to become whoever they are becoming, without your observation, and without any reference to what you are maintaining in your interior life. What the mind is holding is a construction, assembled from specific materials and sustained by specific fuels that the mind itself continues to provide, entirely independently of anything the other person does or fails to do. Memory is the first material. The mind returns to particular moments with a faithfulness that can feel almost like loyalty, a specific tone of voice in a specific conversation, the exact quality of a particular afternoon when something between two people still felt genuinely possible, the weight of something said or left unsaid that later turned out to carry more significance than it appeared to carry at the time. These moments feel vivid because the mind has returned to them enough times to wear grooves in the direction of its own attention, and travel along grooves feels effortless because the path is already worn smooth. But memory reconstructs each time, shaped by what you now know, by what you now wish had been different, by the emotional coloring of the present moment from which you are currently remembering. The moment you keep returning to is already a version of itself, carrying your current grief and your current longing woven into it, making it subtly different from what it actually was when it first occurred. Imagination is the second material. The mind generates versions of the person as they are now. What they might be thinking about you today, what they would say if they could see what your days have been like since the last time you were in each other's lives, what they might do or feel if circumstances were slightly different from how they actually are. These imagined exchanges feel convincing because they are built from genuine knowledge of the person, their characteristic responses, their particular vocabulary, the specific ways they move through the world when you knew them well. The living person today has continued changing in ways you have no access to, in ways that may have been significant, in ways that might surprise you entirely if you actually encountered them now. The person in your imagined conversations is a combination of an older version of them and whatever you need them to say in this particular moment. Desire is the third material, and perhaps the most important to name directly. Something specific was wanted from this person, a quality of being seen, a specific kind of warmth, the feeling of mattering in this person's particular way of regarding things. The mind returns to the construction because the wanting has not resolved, and the construction provides a space where the wanting can continue to exist, even when the actual person is no longer available to receive it. This is why the thought arrives most insistently at the moments when something in daily life touches the old wanting, when you are tired, when something has gone wrong, when the evening goes quiet in a way that makes the absence feel not abstract, but shaped and physically present. Desire keeps the construction available in those moments, so that when attention goes looking, there is somewhere familiar for it to land. Hurt is the fourth material, and the most durable of all. Unresolved hurt returns to check whether anything has changed, whether the wound is a different size this morning than it was last night, whether some new piece of understanding has arrived that would finally make sense of what happened and why. It never finds what it is looking for in this checking, which is precisely why the checking continues. The mind cannot leave the wound alone because leaving it alone feels like abandoning the question the wound raised, and the question still feels as though it deserves an honest answer. So the checking continues, returning to the same interior place, consuming the same quality of attention, producing the same absence of resolution it produced every time before. These four materials share one crucial characteristic. None of them require the other person's participation. The construction runs entirely on your attention. You supply the fuel. You sustain the flame. You are the only one maintaining the version of them that continues to occupy so much of your interior space. The person you cannot stop thinking about may be living their days entirely undisturbed by the fact that you are thinking about them. The construction makes no demand on them whatsoever. It is a private arrangement, conducted entirely within you, between you and a version of them you have assembled and continue to maintain. When this recognition arrives, it tends to come with two feelings sitting close together. The first is uncomfortable, because it means the grip is not being maintained by anything the other person is doing, which means it cannot be ended by anything they might do differently. Their apology, their return, any change in their circumstances, none of these could dissolve what is fundamentally a construction of your own sustained attention. The second feeling, sitting directly underneath the discomfort, is considerably more useful. If the construction is yours, then the maintaining of it is yours as well. And what you are maintaining, you have the capacity to stop maintaining. The teaching does not ask you to dismiss what you felt as unreal, or to produce a version of release that does not match what is genuinely present in you. What you felt was real. What happened between you and this person was real. The pain of it is real. It asks only that you see clearly what you are holding right now, a construction assembled from your own materials, running on your own fuel, requiring your continued returning to it in order to keep running. Seeing this clearly is the first loosening. It is the beginning of the path ahead, not its completion. But it is the moment when descending from the pole becomes something the mind is willing to begin considering. Take a breath here, wherever you are listening from. If there is someone in your mind right now, and perhaps there is, perhaps that is exactly why you are here tonight, see if you can stay with them for just a moment, not to replay anything or rehearse anything, but simply to notice what version of them your mind has been holding and maintaining. Not who they are today, somewhere in the world, living their own days, and making their own decisions entirely independent of your attention, but the particular version assembled inside your own mind, built from specific memories, from imagined conversations, from the precise moments your attention returns to most readily when it goes looking for them in the quiet hours. That version is yours, assembled from your own materials, sustained by your own returning to it, existing nowhere in the world outside the space your attention occupies when it leaves the present. You do not need to dissolve it right now, or decide anything about it, or feel anything particular about having seen it clearly. Let the recognition rest alongside whatever is already present in you, the way a second lamp changes the quality of a room without requiring you to extinguish anything that was already there. Even when this recognition settles clearly, even when you see what you are holding and understand precisely what it is made of, the mind does something that anyone who has ever tried to release a person will recognize without any need for explanation. It brings the thought back. The recognition does not prevent the returning. The thought arrives again. The familiar quality of ache returns with it. The construction resumes as though the previous several minutes of clarity had left no trace at all. This is not failure. It is simply a different question from the one this section has been addressing, a question about how the mind becomes conditioned to return to certain patterns, about why specific thoughts come back regardless of how clearly you have understood that you would prefer them to release, and about what the Dhamma actually offers when insight alone turns out not to be sufficient to stop the returning. The Buddha addressed this directly, with 5 specific and practical responses for a thought that hammers back regardless of understanding and regardless of intention. A monk named Vangisa encountered this pattern in himself, in a way he could neither manage privately nor fully conceal from those around him, and his honesty in bringing it directly to the Buddha produced one of the most practical and uncomplicatedly honest teachings on this subject in the entire Pali Canon. Vangisa was, by any external measure, exactly the kind of practitioner a monastic community most needs. He had joined the Buddha's order with genuine intention and brought with him an unusual gift, a facility with language, a capacity to find the precise and careful expression for subtle interior experiences that other monks found illuminating in the particular way that certain voices are illuminating, not because they introduce entirely new ideas, but because they articulate clearly what others have been feeling, without yet finding words adequate to what they have been feeling. He composed verses that traveled between members of the community, that were quoted in teaching contexts, that seemed to arrive at exactly the phrasing a given experience required. He was articulate, clearly committed to his chosen direction, and by all visible evidence, making the kind of steady and reliable progress that is quiet encouragement to everyone around it, simply by being present and continuing. What was not visible from outside was the thought that kept coming back. The Pali Canon records his struggle with a directness that is almost startling, given how openly it exposes the interior life of a monk with a visible reputation for quality. During the alms rounds that monks made each morning through nearby villages, walking through early light in silence, wooden bowls in hand, moving through streets that were only beginning their day, Vangisa would encounter women going about the first tasks of their mornings, women drawing water from village wells, women building morning fires and preparing the day's first meal, women walking familiar paths between their homes and the market, moving with the ease of people who have made this exact walk many hundreds of times and have long since stopped consciously navigating it. When Vangisa encountered these women, his mind immediately generated a response he had not requested and could not seem to prevent. Thoughts arose. Not simply arose and passed, as thoughts are understood to do when the mind has been sufficiently trained through consistent and sustained practice. They arose and returned, arose again, with the patient insistence of something that had concluded it had a right to be there and was not particularly interested in his current views on whether it did. He understood exactly what was happening. He was not confused about the nature of what he was experiencing, not uncertain whether it aligned with the direction he had chosen, not unclear about what the teaching said about this particular pattern. He had studied the teaching carefully enough to recognize the mechanism clearly and to articulate it with considerable precision. He knew what the thought was, where it came from, what conditions in his own history had produced it, and what continued to sustain it. He could describe the process accurately in language precise enough to be useful to others. And still the thought came back, each time with the same insistence as the time before. His understanding had not made it lighter or shorter or less capable of pulling his attention in the direction it had always pulled it. He could watch each thought arrive with complete clarity about what it was, name it precisely as it came, and feel it take hold, regardless, the way you can know with certainty that you are inside a dream and still find yourself responding to its terms as though they were the terms of the world you actually inhabit. This is the thing that no instruction about releasing a person fully prepares you for. Seeing a conditioned pattern clearly does not dissolve it. The mind can understand something with complete accuracy and continue doing it anyway, because understanding and conditioning are two distinct processes operating through different mechanisms and on different timescales. Understanding can shift in a single moment of clarity. Conditioning changes through sustained practice over real time. Knowing that a groove is a groove does not fill it. A groove worn into stone by years of running water does not fill itself in because you have correctly identified it and understood precisely how it formed. The water continues following it because the groove is there, and a cleared path is a cleared path, and the water does not consult anyone's preferences about where it ought to go. Vangeesa's mind had a groove. It had been worn before ordination, across the years of his lay life when attending to beauty had been neither problematic nor out of place in the life he was then living. The mind that responds to beautiful forms had been exercised and reinforced across many years until the response had become effectively automatic, fast, operating largely below the level of conscious intention, entirely independent of deliberate decision on any given morning. Ordination changed his direction completely, what he intended, where he was heading, the entire framework within which he was living his days. It did not, by itself, change the groove. The groove remained where it had always been, and when stimulation arrived each morning that matched its shape, the mind followed it in the direction it had followed for years, carrying thoughts he no longer wanted to where they had always gone, without any apparent awareness of or interest in his current position on the matter. What made his situation particularly challenging was that he understood the teaching well enough to feel the distance between that understanding and his daily experience as a form of failure. A practitioner who does not know the teaching cannot measure the gap between where he is and where the teaching points. Vangeesa knew the teaching. He could articulate precisely why the thought returned, what generated it, and why following it was counterproductive. None of that articulate knowledge had closed the gap. If anything, the clarity of his understanding made the persistence of the groove feel more indicting, not less, because he could not plausibly claim ignorance as an explanation. He applied himself to the problem with the consistency of someone who understands that practice, not avoidance, is the only path through a difficulty. He kept his gaze directed downward on arm's rounds, his attention on the path immediately in front of him. When thoughts arose, he brought the teaching actively to mind, recalling what he understood about impermanence, about the body's nature, about the mechanics of how craving sustains itself, and what it costs when followed repeatedly. He applied will directly, a decision at the threshold of each morning that today the thought would not take hold. The thought came back anyway, not always immediately, but reliably, and with a patience that outlasted his effort. An hour of relative quiet, and then it would arrive again at the same interior place, as though the quiet had been a resting rather than a resolution. There is a specific quality of discouragement that accumulates when sustained effort meets a difficulty that does not proportionally respond. It settles into the gap between what you clearly understand about your situation and what you can actually sustain under real daily conditions over real time. And in that gap, the discouragement presents itself not simply as a feeling, but as evidence that something is specifically wrong with you, that other practitioners navigate this territory with an ease you cannot access, that your persistent difficulty, despite genuine effort, reveals some deficiency of fundamental nature that more suited people have somehow managed not to carry into their practice. This is a painful story to inhabit, made more painful by how convincing it can feel at the moments when you are most tired, and the thought has just returned for what seems like the 100th consecutive time without any detectable reduction in its force. Vangisa brought his difficulty to the senior monk, Ananda, first. He described his situation plainly. The returning thought, the effort applied to it over time, the persistent gap between his understanding and his capacity to hold that understanding steady under actual conditions. He did not minimize the situation or dress it in more flattering language than it warranted. His honesty in this is worth pausing over. He was a monk with a visible gift and a genuine reputation, moving through a community where evidence of spiritual progress carries weight, and he chose to describe his actual experience with full accuracy, rather than offering a version shaped to present more favorably. Ananda directed him to the Buddha. Vangisa went, carrying the same honest account rather than a tidier version, prepared for a more receptive reception. The Buddha's response is preserved in the Pali Canon, and what is most significant about it is not only the content of the 5 methods offered, but the quality of the offering itself. No surprise was registered at Vangisa's difficulty. No concern expressed that a monk of his evident gifts was still dealing with something so elementary. No suggestion that this was unusual or pointed to some deficiency requiring special examination. The Buddha received a plain account of a thought that returned despite both understanding and effort, and offered 5 graduated responses in the steady manner of someone who has seen this precise kind of difficulty before and knows exactly what it requires. Here is what the Buddha offered. The first response is redirection. When an unwanted thought arises, bring the attention deliberately to a different object, something genuinely wholesome, something the mind can rest on without generating further complication. The breath is always available for this, always present, always occurring in the current moment, rather than in any past or imagined future. The physical sensation of sitting or walking, of feet on ground, of hands in the lap, a quality of genuine care or goodwill towards someone nearby, the simple, unremarkable fact of being alive in this specific moment, rather than in any other. The Buddha described this as a carpenter driving a finer peg to displace a coarser one already in place. The new object of attention does not fight the unwanted thought directly, but simply moves into the space the thought was heading toward and fills it through presence rather than through opposition. A thought arriving into a space already occupied by genuine attention has nowhere to establish itself. This is particularly useful for the person whose thought arrives with immediacy and vividness. It feels more compelling than a simple anchor like the breath. The practice of returning to the breath anyway, in the very moment when the thought arrives, with its characteristic urgency, trains a different response than the one the groove produces automatically. Not because the breath is more interesting than the thought, but because the breath is here, and the thought points toward a construction that exists nowhere real. Each such return adds one small unit of groove filling that would not otherwise have been added. The method costs the least effort of all five, which is why it belongs first and is always worth attempting. The Buddha placed it first not because it always works, but because it always costs the least and is therefore always the right first attempt. The second response is honest examination of what the thought actually produces when followed, not in abstract terms of what the teaching describes, but as direct observation of your own specific experience over real time. What happens in you, concretely, when you follow this particular thought on this particular morning? Does following it deliver ease, resolution, or the sense of arrival it seems to gesture toward in the moment of arising? Or does it produce a brief and unsatisfying engagement, followed by the same restlessness that generated the thought in the first place, leaving you no further along and slightly more depleted from the following? The mind carrying a groove also carries a particular relationship with anticipation, a sense, reliable in its arising and consistently wrong in its prediction, that this return might yield something different from what every previous return has yielded. That anticipation is part of how the groove sustains itself. It makes following the thought feel potentially worthwhile, right up to the moment of following it, at which point the actual consequence arrives and is not what the anticipation promised. There is a specific pattern worth observing honestly for the thought of this particular person. What it promises is usually some form of contact or resolution, understanding what happened, knowing what they think now, processing something that did not get processed at the time. But following the thought never delivers contact or resolution. It delivers more thought, and more thought delivers more thought. Examining whether the thought has ever, on any of the many occasions you have followed it, actually resolved anything, answering that honestly, makes the next arrival slightly less persuasive than it would otherwise be. This response is not argument against the thought, It is honest accounting conducted in the thought's presence rather than in the abstract. The third response is deliberate non-attention, and the distinction from suppression matters because they require different things. Suppression requires sustained and active opposition, maintaining a resistance against the thought that has a cost must be continuously renewed and frequently intensifies what it is resisting through the very act of sustained opposition, in the way that pressing against something can make both the pressing and the pressed thing more present than they would have been otherwise. Deliberate non-attention requires neither effort nor opposition. It is the simple decision not to look in a particular direction. The Buddha described it as a person who does not want to see a disturbing sight and therefore looks elsewhere, not from any effort to make the sight cease to exist, not from denial that it is there, but because looking is always a choice, and a different choice is available in every moment, regardless of what is present in the field of vision. When the thought arises, you do not engage with its content, follow its thread, argue with its presence, or make any project of it in any direction whatsoever. In the context of the person you cannot release, this response looks like the thought arises with its characteristic quality and texture. You recognize it, and you give your attention to whatever is physically present in your immediate environment, the surface you are sitting on, the temperature of the air, any sound within hearing range that requires nothing of you, not as escape, but as a redirect to what is actually here, rather than to where the thought points, which is somewhere else entirely. You give your attention elsewhere, with the quiet simplicity of turning in a room to face a different part of it, without announcement, without making the turning into an event. The fourth response attends to an earlier stage of the thought's development, before it has fully arrived and gathered its characteristic momentum. The Buddha offered the image of a runner who gradually allows the running to slow, from a run to a jog, from a jog to a walk, then to stillness, not because something external stopped the running, but because the runner recognized the running was no longer required and allowed it to come down accordingly. A thought that arrives with full pressing insistence has been building through a sequence of smaller movements, each one creating conditions that make the next more probable. There is an earlier stage, before the full arrival, when the thought is still only forming, still only exerting the first faint pull of attention in the familiar direction, when intervention is easiest and costs the least. That first faint pull has a recognizable quality, different from the full thought, a slight tilting of attention in a familiar direction, sometimes accompanied by a small shift in physical sensation, a slight contraction somewhere in the chest or throat, a faint change in how the breath moves. Learning to recognize this earlier signal is a significant development, because the earlier the recognition, the less momentum there is to work with. Catching the thought at this stage allows a response while it is still gathering rather than already gathered. This is the most subtle of the 5 responses, depending on a quality of fine and early attention that becomes more reliably available through consistent practice over time. On occasions when the thought bypasses all detectable early stages and arrives already fully formed, something more direct is required. The fifth response the Buddha offered last, and offered honestly, without softening what it asks for. He said, if none of the previous four responses has been sufficient on this particular occasion, if the thought has moved through all of them and presses on with undiminished force, then hold the mind against it through plain and sustained effort. The language he used was deliberately physical, teeth clenched, tongue pressed against the upper palate, the mind bearing down on what is arising with the direct and entirely unglamorous force of simple restraint. The image was of a stronger person holding a weaker one, not through technique or elegance, but through the uncomplicated application of greater force to what requires containing until it passes. No grace operates here. No insight is required. The thought presses, and the mind holds against it, and eventually the thought passes, because everything passes, including the most insistent thought about the most significant person you have ever known. For the person you cannot release, this fifth response is sometimes what an ordinary Tuesday morning requires, not because the thought is at its most intense on ordinary Tuesdays, but because the other four responses have been applied, and the thought has outlasted them on this particular morning, and the work is to hold steady until it passes. Doing this honestly is the practice, even when it looks nothing like what practice is supposed to look like when described in the language of insight and transformation. The unglamorous holding still counts. It still makes the groove fractionally shallower than it was before. The structure of the teaching itself carries a message worth noting. The Buddha placed the 5 responses in order from least effortful to most effortful deliberately. This ordering contains a teaching within the teaching. On some occasions, redirecting the attention is sufficient. On other occasions, particularly early in the work of groove filling when the groove is still deep, the 5th response is exactly what the morning requires. The ordering prevents the practitioner from treating the 5th response as evidence of failure, as though, if the practice were going well, the first would always be sufficient. The morning needed what it needed, and you brought the appropriate tool. That is enough. The Buddha closed the teaching with a single image that holds all 5 responses in right relationship to each other. A skilled carpenter keeps many tools and reaches for whichever one the material in front of them, on this specific occasion, actually requires. A carpenter with only one tool is limited to the materials that tool can address. A carpenter with 5 can work with almost anything that arrives, adjusting the approach to the actual nature of the difficulty rather than applying a fixed response to every situation, regardless of fit. These 5 responses are 5 tools. The appropriate tool on any given occasion is the one that fits what is actually present in you right now with this specific arrival. Van Gieser left that conversation with 5 tools he had not possessed when he arrived. The Pali Canon preserves not a record of immediate and complete resolution, but a continuing body of honest and precise work, verses that have survived 25 centuries, because the experiences they describe remain recognizable, without modification to anyone sitting quietly with a thought that refuses to follow instructions about where it should go and when it has been here long enough. Now bring this directly into wherever you are listening from tonight. The thought that returns to the person you cannot release has been following a groove established before you decided you wanted it to stop, and continuing to follow it with a reliability that has nothing to do with how committed you are to stopping it. The groove does not update itself in response to your insight about its nature or your clarity about what the thought is made of. It offers the familiar path, and the mind without a sufficiently practiced alternative takes it, because minds follow paths that have been used long enough to feel like the natural direction of things rather than one particular direction chosen from among available directions. The instruction to simply stop thinking about them, to decide that, and then enact it, to release a person through force of intention alone, has been falling short, not because you lack the capacity for it, but because the instruction lacks the method that capacity needs in order to work. A decision tells the water where you would prefer it to flow. It does not, by itself, carve the alternative path the water requires in order to go there. That carving is done through method applied patiently and repeatedly, one occasion at a time, over whatever duration the groove's existing depth requires. That is not discouraging information. It is clarifying information because it means your difficulty has a comprehensible cause that has nothing to do with your deficiency and everything to do with how conditioning operates in a mind that has practiced something long enough. One clarification worth making when using these tools with a specific person: they are not intended to make you feel nothing about this person or to erase what happened between you. They are tools for working with the returning thought, not for eliminating the reality of what the thought refers to. The person was real. The relationship was real. What is not real is the version of them currently running in your mind, assembled from materials the previous section described in detail. Working with the groove is not working against the truth of your experience. It is working with the mind's conditioned pattern so that, over time, the pattern becomes responsive to your current intentions, rather than running entirely on the fuel of what it practiced before you had any intention about the matter. The 5 responses are available to you right now, in any ordinary moment, without special conditions or preparation. Begin with the first. If it is sufficient on this occasion, use it and return to your day. If it is not sufficient with this particular arrival on this particular morning, move to the next. Work with what this specific moment requires, rather than what you feel it should require, given how long you have already been working with this. Each application of any of these responses makes the groove marginally shallower than it was before that application. Not in a way that announces itself or feels like identifiable progress on the day it happens. In the way that any well-worn path gradually fills in through consistent and patient redirection, one occasion at a time, over time, until one morning the thought arrives and finds less of a path ready to receive it than it found before. When the thought returns, you are not failing. You are a practitioner with a groove and 5 tools, and the returning is simply the moment when one of those tools is useful. Find the one that fits this morning's particular arrival. Apply it. Return to your life. Beneath the groove, and beneath the constructed version of them assembled from your own materials, there is a third and quieter layer of the grip that neither of the previous two explanations has fully reached. That phrase, setting it down, contains an assumption that the grip is something held from outside yourself, something picked up and put down once you decide to. What a monk named Kemaka described, lying seriously ill in a forest dwelling, while 30 fellow practitioners pressed him with careful questions, was something more intimate than that, a sense of self so subtly entangled with the person who cannot be released that the grip felt less like carrying something external and more like being something, in a way that made releasing it feel like erasing a part of who you are. His description of this, delivered from a sickbed to practitioners who thought they already understood the pattern, is so accurate to the lived experience of trying to release someone genuinely significant that hearing it tends to feel not like receiving a teaching, but like being clearly seen by someone who already knew exactly what you have been carrying and exactly why setting it down has felt. Every time you have sincerely tried, like considerably more than it should. The Pali Canon records an exchange between a seriously ill monk and 30 of his fellow practitioners that has very little visible drama on its surface and an enormous amount of precision in its substance. The ill monk was named Kemaka, and he was living in a forest dwelling during what the texts describe without embellishment as a significant illness, not a minor seasonal ailment that inconveniences without genuinely limiting, but something serious enough that walking any real distance was beyond what his body could manage on the days when the exchange the 30 monks needed to have with him was taking place. The 30 practitioners were gathered somewhere else in the same forest complex, near enough that messages could be carried between the two locations without great difficulty, but far enough that actual visits in either direction required a deliberate effort that Kemaka's condition made genuinely costly. The exchange mattered enough to conduct by messenger anyway. The 30 monks sent a practitioner named Darsaka to carry their questions to Kemaka's dwelling and his responses back to where they waited. In the careful relay that communities use, when direct exchange is complicated by circumstance, but the inquiry is too important to set aside until circumstance improves. Darsaka was patient and thorough, making the trip between the two groups as many times as the exchange required, arriving at Kemaka's sickbed with questions from the 30 and returning to where they waited with whatever Kemaka had said in response. This went on for most of a morning, question followed by answer, followed by further question, each exchange moving the inquiry deeper into territory that required more precision than the previous exchange had provided. The questions the 30 monks were pressing were specific, and they addressed the most interior dimension of Kemaka's practice. Had he fully and directly seen through what the teaching describes as the 5 aggregates: form, feeling, perception, mental formations, and consciousness, the 5 categories through which the mind assembles its sense of who it is and what belongs to it, and what experience means in terms of a self at the center of it. Did he identify any of these 5 as self? Did he experience any of them as the essential kemaka, the permanent and independent entity that the mind habitually treats as the foundational reality beneath everything else it experiences? His answer came back through Darsaka. No, to each. He did not identify form as self, feeling as self, perception, mental formations, or consciousness as self. He had examined each of the 5 with sustained attention and genuine directness, and found no permanent, independent entity residing in any of them that could be honestly named as the essential self that the mind so confidently assumes must be there somewhere. This was not a position he had adopted as a matter of intellectual agreement with the teaching's propositions. He had looked directly with the kind of first-person observation that the teaching consistently distinguishes from merely holding a correct view, and found nothing there that deserved the name. The 30 monks processed this answer and sent another question back through Darsaka. If Kemaka had genuinely and directly seen through each of the 5 aggregates, if his seeing was real rather than conceptual, then surely his practice had arrived at its completion. Surely there was no remaining sense of I am, no residual experience of selfhood, still present and still functioning, no further dimension of the grip still operating somewhere in his experience. Surely what remained was only clarity, fully established, and no longer subject to the subtle distortions of a self-sense that had been seen through completely. The answer that came back was also no, and this is the moment when the teaching crosses from an account of advanced monastic practice into a description of something you have been living inside and trying to articulate about your own experience without quite having found the right language for what you have been trying to describe. Kemaka could not say that the subtle background sense of I am had fully cleared. He could not say that the identity-making activity of the mind, the continuous, background process that organizes experience into the ongoing narrative of a self with a history and a future and things that belong to it, had ceased to generate any residual sense of his own presence at the center of what was occurring. Moment by moment, something remained. This was not confusion on his part, not wishful thinking in the opposite direction, not spiritual modesty about a completion he was too cautious to claim. Something genuinely remained, functioning below the level of any specific belief about the aggregates, more ambient than any particular thought, present in the overall texture of how experience organized itself, rather than in any identifiable and addressable feature of that experience. He was clear about this, and clear that he could not in honesty say otherwise. The 30 monks kept pressing Darsaka to carry their questions. If the remaining sense of I am was not located in the form, not in the feeling, not in the perception, not in the mental formations, not in the consciousness, then what precisely was its nature and where exactly did it live? Could Khemaka describe it in terms specific enough that they could understand what he was pointing toward? Could he give it enough definition that they could see what he was seeing, rather than simply knowing that he was pointing at something real that remained beyond the reach of their current understanding? The questions grew more specific with each exchange, pressing from different angles toward the same unclear center, the way a person circles something in low light, trying to get a direct look at it, rather than only its shadow. Here, Khemaka stopped sending messages and made the journey himself. The Pali Canon notes this transition without editorial comment, and the lack of comment is itself worth holding for a moment, because the decision it records is not small. He was seriously ill. The journey cost him something real. He made it anyway, apparently having concluded that what needed to be said next could not travel accurately through an intermediary and remain fully what it needed to be when it arrived. Some things require the person who has experienced them to be present in the room, speaking in their own voice, watching whether the image is landing the way it needs to land, ready to add or adjust if the first offering does not fully reach the people it is offered to. He arrived where the 30 monks were gathered, settled himself among them with whatever physical difficulty the illness imposed on the settling, and described a scent. "Imagine a piece of cloth," he said, "that has been genuinely and thoroughly washed, not superficially rinsed or cleaned to an acceptable level of surface appearance, but washed with actual care and actual completeness until every trace of accumulated residue from previous use has been addressed. Hold this cloth up and find nothing that should not be there. The cleaning was real and complete in every sense that washing is capable of being real and complete. There is no remaining dirt pressed into the weave, no hidden stain that the washing circled without fully reaching, no residue that survived by hiding in a place the cleaning did not thoroughly penetrate. The cloth is clean in the full and unqualified sense of that word, and anyone who examines it carefully will confirm this without hesitation. Now take that genuinely clean cloth and place it inside a closed container alongside flowers, blue lotus, jasmine, or any flower whose fragrance has the particular quality of presence and persistence that certain flowers carry, the kind of scent that moves into surrounding space and settles there rather than remaining only at its source. Leave the cloth sealed in the container with those flowers for a single day, not weeks, not months, simply one day of close proximity between the clean cloth and the living, fragrant blooms enclosed with it. At the end of that day, take the cloth out and hold it close to your face. The cloth carries a scent, not dirt, not any residue from the original accumulation that the careful washing addressed. A scent, something taken into the fabric through proximity, through the sustained and enclosed contact between a clean surface and something fragrant that has settled into the weave in a way that the washing, however thorough and genuinely complete on its own terms, did not and could not have addressed because the scent was not present in the cloth when the washing happened. The scent arrived after the washing, through a different mechanism entirely, and it remains now that the flowers have been removed, not because the cloth is defective, not because the washing was insufficient for what washing was asked to do, but simply because proximity to something fragrant leaves its trace in fabric through a process that is categorically different from the one that cleaning addresses. That scent, Kemaka said to the 30 monks now sitting around him in the forest, is what remains in his experience. He had examined the 5 aggregates and found no self residing within any of them, and that examination had been genuine and the finding real. And still there was a faint but undeniable scent, a residual orientation toward experience that continued organizing moments in terms of a self at their center, that continued generating the subtle background sense of I am even in the absence of any specific belief about a self that could be examined and corrected, not as a thought he was having or a position he was taking, not as a view he held about himself or a doctrine he was clinging to against better understanding, as a quality of the fabric itself, taken on through sustained proximity and still present in the weave now that the proximity had ended, requiring something categorically different from further examination of the aggregates to address, because it does not live in any place that examination reaches. The 30 monks sitting around Kemaka received this image in the particular quality of silence that arrives when something said aloud for what may be the first time is also, at the same moment, entirely recognizable. The image did not introduce an idea they had never encountered. It found language for something they had been living inside without having the precise description for it that would allow them to approach it directly and work with it clearly, rather than feeling it vaguely and not quite knowing what to do with the vague feeling. A scent taken on through sustained proximity, present in the fabric after the source of the fragrance has long departed, requiring neither the cloth's ongoing cooperation nor the flower's continued presence to remain present and real in the weave of the fabric. Now bring this image directly into the experience of trying to release a specific person from the mind, because this is precisely what the teaching describes when applied to that territory. The person who has been genuinely significant in your life has been in proximity to the identity-making activity of your mind for whatever time the relationship was real and active. Not proximity to your physical body only, though that too may have been reorganized by their presence. Proximity to the continuous background process by which the mind constructs who you are, the always running activity that takes everything that happens and weaves it into the ongoing narrative of your life, the story of what you are doing with your days, what the future holds the shape of, what the past means in terms of where it has been leading, and what your present experience reveals about who you fundamentally are. This identity-making activity took the relationship in and integrated it into the fabric it was constructing, not as a minor or peripheral element that could be removed without affecting the surrounding weave, but as something worked through the center of how you were understanding yourself during the time the relationship existed and continued to exist. The relationship shaped what you expected your future to look like. It changed what you valued in your daily life because your values intersected with theirs and were sometimes genuinely altered by that intersection in ways you may not have been tracking as they happened. It shaped what your past meant because the history of your life was being understood partly in terms of the person it had been moving toward in the period when the relationship was developing into what it eventually became. It shaped what certain mornings felt like, what particular kinds of evenings meant, what specific places and sounds and particular qualities of light carried that they did not carry before the person arrived in your life with sufficient depth and duration to weave themselves into the fabric of how your daily experience was organized. All of this integration happened through sustained proximity, through the long daily contact between their presence and your identity-making activity, which took what proximity brought it and incorporated it into the ongoing construction of who you understood yourself to be. The cloth was clean before they arrived. The contact placed a fragrance in it. The fragrance remains now that the contact has ended, not because you are choosing to maintain it, and not because you lack the will to release it, but because proximity to something genuinely significant always leaves its scent in the fabric of identity through a process that is deeper than will and older than understanding. When the relationship ended or changed beyond recognition, the identity-making activity did not extract the integrated thread and continue with the rest of the fabric restored to its prior state. That is not how fabric works, and it is not how identity works. The thread had been woven through other threads, its presence altering how neighboring elements sat relative to each other. The texture of that region of the cloth changed in ways both visible and less visible by the sustained presence of the thread through it. The cloth after the thread has departed is not the cloth it was before the thread arrived, and the identity after the relationship ends is not identical to the identity that preceded the relationship's beginning. Something has been reorganized at a level below the surface of conscious choice, in the place where identity assembles itself without consulting your preferences about how the assembling should go. This is why releasing them feels like losing yourself. Not as an exaggeration, not as evidence that you have allowed this to go further than it should have, not as a sign of insufficient detachment or insufficient understanding or insufficient effort applied over insufficient time, as the accurate recognition of something structural. This person was woven into how you have understood yourself to be in the world, and releasing them involves a genuine rearrangement of that understanding, a process with real implications for the story. The identity-making activity has been organizing itself around, not a simple act of decision that a sufficiently determined person completes in a single morning. The resistance you have felt is not weakness. It is the accurate perception of what is actually involved in this particular releasing, which is more than the word releasing typically suggests when it is used to describe a simple and immediate act of letting go. The Dhamma's response to the residual scent is specific, and it differs from both of the approaches that most naturally suggest themselves when something persists in your experience that you would prefer not to persist. The first instinct is to apply more effort to the removal, to examine the residue more rigorously, understand its origins more completely, bring greater clarity and stronger intention to the project of clearing what previous applications of clarity and intention have not yet cleared. Wash the cloth again, more carefully this time, with better technique and more thoroughness than the previous washing managed. Karmaka's image addresses this directly. The scent is not in the place that washing reaches. It took up residence through a process that washing was not designed to address, and applying more of what has not been reaching it will not suddenly begin reaching it because of the increased application. The second instinct is suppression, to hold the awareness of the scent below the surface of daily experience through sustained effort, in the hope that consistent and long-maintained suppression will eventually accomplish what recognition and understanding have not accomplished. This requires continuous maintenance, which consumes energy otherwise available for the actual life being lived. It also maintains the suppressed thing in a particular way. A person actively working to not experience something is experiencing it in the specific sense of organizing their present moment around the active project of its non-experience. Suppression keeps the scent central, rather than creating the conditions in which the scent can move naturally toward whatever clearing it is already, at its own pace, moving toward. What Karmaka pointed toward was patient, direct observation of the sense arising and passing in actual experience, as it actually occurs in the texture of ordinary days. Not analysis of its origins or argument with its legitimacy or project making of any kind around its presence or absence. Simply watching it appear. This particular ambient quality in experience, this sense of the person woven into how you have been understanding yourself, and watching it dissolve again with the unhurried attention of someone who has concluded that honest presence is what this situation requires, rather than management or intervention or the forced acceleration of a natural process that will proceed at its own pace, regardless of the forcing. The passing is as important to witness as the arising. On each individual occasion, without exception, the sense that arises will also pass, not permanently after a single observation, not in a way that forecloses any future arising, but on this specific occasion, in this specific moment of experience, the presence is followed by an absence, the scent by a clearing, the sense of this person woven through the fabric of your identity by a moment in which that specific sense is simply not what is currently present in experience. Observing this directly and repeatedly gives the mind something real to stand on. The arising did not last forever on this occasion. Things that arise pass, including the subtlest and most durable residue of the most significant person who has ever been woven into the fabric of how you have understood who you are. The cloth does not need to be rewashed. It needs open air, time, and the quality of patient and non-forcing presence that allows the scent to move at its own pace toward the clearing that is already, in its own way and on its own timeline, quietly underway beneath the surface of each day in which you are living your actual life, rather than being consumed by the project of managing what remains from the one that ended. Each occasion of patient observation, each time the sense arises, and you watch it, rather than following it or suppressing it, contributes to the natural clearing in the way that each hour of open air contributes to the gradual fading of a scent from fabric, not through any dramatic intervention, not through visible progress on any single occasion, but cumulatively and reliably over the time that the depth of the integration genuinely requires. In practical terms, this looks quieter than almost anything else suggested so far in this journey. When the sense of them arises, not the constructed version, not the grooves returning thought, but this more ambient quality of their presence in how you have been understanding yourself. The practice is to let yourself notice it without immediately doing anything about it, not following it into its full emotional range, not pressing it back below the surface, not analyzing whether it is reasonable for it still to be here at this point, or debating its legitimacy in terms of how long has passed, or how thoroughly you have already worked with everything else this person has left in your interior life. Simply, this is here right now, arising in experience, carrying what it carries about this person and about who you have been in relation to them. And then watching what it does, noticing whether it intensifies or softens over the course of the next few minutes, whether it expands into related territory or begins to thin at its edges, the way fog thins when morning light moves steadily into it from a direction it cannot avoid for long, not helping it toward any of these directions and not impeding any of them. Simply present to it with the patient attention of someone who has chosen to trust the natural process rather than force a pace the process cannot be forced into without cost. This quality of direct witnessing is itself something the reorganizing identity rarely receives from us. Most of the time, the reorganizing happens underground, in the half-attended spaces of daily life, beneath the surface of ordinary functioning, in the background, while the foreground runs the practical business of the day, without reference to what is shifting below, offering it genuine, clear, unhurried attention, not therapeutic analysis or interpretive framework building, simply honest presence to what is actually occurring in this experience right now, is what allows the natural clearing to proceed at the rate it is capable of proceeding when it is neither being forced nor being entirely ignored. Khemaka eventually attained what he described to the 30 monks sitting around him in the forest that day. The Pali Canon preserves this not as a sudden and dramatic clearing, but as the outcome of sustained and patient practice of exactly the kind he described, each instance of direct observation adding its small contribution to the natural clearing of a scent that had taken real time and real proximity to settle into the fabric, and that required real time and real openness to leave it completely. The cloth did not become a different cloth. It became a cloth from which the particular scent that proximity had placed in it had finally and fully cleared through the same natural process by which any scent clears from any fabric, given sufficient time and open air, and the absence of the conditions that would only press it deeper into the weave, rather than allow it the natural movement toward absence that is always, at some pace, already underway. Sit with this for a breath before we continue. The grip across 3 sections has revealed itself to be more layered than the simple instruction to let go ever acknowledges. A constructed version of the person assembled from your own materials and sustained by your own returning attention. A conditioned groove in the mind's movement that follows familiar paths regardless of your current intentions about direction, requiring graduated and patient method rather than will alone. And this quieter, more ambient residual scent, a presence in the fabric of identity, taken on through genuine proximity to a person who was genuinely significant, which clears not through effort or understanding, but through the patient, honest, non-forcing observation of its arising and passing over the time that the depth of its integration requires. Each layer has been addressed by what it actually responds to. What the next teaching addresses is something that all 3 sections have been approaching without yet landing on directly, something about when the person you are holding actually exists, and what the answer to that question reveals about what is being held, and how the holding might finally, fully release. A monk who had been carrying a single difficult exchange in his mind for months discovered this in an encounter with the Buddha that produced one of the quietest and most precise teachings in the entire canon, not about who the person was, but about when they existed and what becomes available to experience once that question has been answered clearly and lived rather than merely understood. A question has been sitting underneath everything described in this journey, present through the construction and the groove and the residual scent, without being directly addressed by any of them. It has its own particular quality, patient, foundational, waiting for enough of the other layers to be genuinely encountered before it can arrive in the specific and direct form it actually has. It does not announce itself urgently. It arrives the way a thought arrives, when the mind has been sufficiently quieted for long enough that something which was always there finally has the conditions to become audible. It does not require elaborate preparation to ask. It simply requires that what has come before be genuinely inhabited, rather than merely understood, before it can be heard at the depth it actually operates at. The question is this: when does the person you have been holding in your mind actually exist? The constructed version assembled from memory, imagination, desire, and hurt runs in the mind's interior space right now, present moment activity, consuming present moment attention, and energy, available to the returning attention at any moment it decides to return. The groove follows its familiar direction, in present moment experience, each returning, requiring no conscious initiation. The residual scent persists in the ambient texture of how identity has been organizing itself, arising and passing in actual, present moment observation. All of this is occurring now, in the current moment of this listening. But the specific version of the person being held, the particular exchange being replayed with such faithfulness that the mind treats it as a live event rather than a completed recording, when does that actually exist? The exchange happened at a specific moment in time that is no longer occurring. The exact configuration of circumstances that made that moment what it was. Two people, in those particular interior states, in that particular location, with everything in each of their lives arranged exactly as it was arranged on that specific day, came together once, produced the moment it produced, and then dissolved completely. The conditions that assembled that moment have not reassembled since, and cannot reassemble, because all the components of that configuration have continued changing in the ways that living people and living circumstances always continue changing, through the ordinary and unrepeatable passage of time forward. What the mind has been replaying since that dissolution is a representation of the moment. The moment itself ended. The representation is assembled from what the mind retained of it, shaped by everything that has happened since, and reconstructed each time with the emotional coloring that the current moment of the visiting brings to the reconstruction, rather than only the coloring that was present on the original day. The moment you keep returning to is already a version of itself, carrying your current grief and your current longing woven into whatever the original actually contained. There was a monk in the community gathered around the Buddha who had been carrying a specific exchange in his mind for months, without being fully conscious of how thoroughly the present life he was living had been vacated in service of maintaining that carrying. He was not a new practitioner finding his footing in unfamiliar territory. He had been working with the teaching long enough that the difficulty had a settled, habitual quality to it, less a deliberate act of remembering than a gravitational pull, a direction the attention followed with an automaticity that required no conscious initiation and persisted regardless of whatever else was present in his field of experience on any given morning. The exchange was simply there, the way weather is there, operating in the background of every other activity with a reliability that had stopped requiring his conscious cooperation some time ago, that arrived and departed on its own schedule, that produced its particular quality of pull, regardless of what else his day contained, or what quality of attention he had available on any given day to offer anything beyond it. The exchange itself had not been externally dramatic. What occurred between him and another person on a particular day was, from any outside perspective, unremarkable, a conversation that had not gone the way he had hoped, a response from someone whose regard mattered to him that landed with an impact out of proportion to any observable feature of the situation. The moment passed as moments pass, and was followed by the ordinary continuation of the day's remaining events, without any visible indication that something had lodged in him with sufficient durability to still be running months. Later, from outside, nothing particular had happened. Inside, a permanent address had been established in his interior life, and his attention had been making regular and extended visits to that address ever since, spending time there that was simultaneously present moment time, because all time is present moment time as it is being lived, and organized entirely around something that was no longer occurring anywhere in actual present experience. He had applied himself to the difficulty with genuine consistency and genuine effort across those months. He had worked with the returning thought, using the graduated responses the teaching offers for thoughts that come back, regardless of understanding and regardless of intention. He had brought patient, non-forcing observation to the residual quality in the fabric of his identity, the scent that had settled into the weave through sustained proximity and required open, unhurried witnessing rather than further examination or suppression. Both of these genuine applications had produced genuine and real results, a somewhat shallower groove than before the applications began, a somewhat more spacious relationship to the ambient presence of the exchange in how he understood himself. What neither had addressed was something more foundational that he was beginning to sense without yet having the precise language for it. It was not the quality of the mind's relationship to the exchange while engaged with it, the grooves returning, the sense arising and passing. It was the structure of a life in which a past moment had become a permanent address that consumed present moment time and attention without providing anything that genuine present moment experience provides to someone actually inhabiting it. He brought this to the Buddha with the honesty available to a practitioner who has worked faithfully with a difficulty and arrived at a point where something essential still seems to be missing, without quite being able to name what the missing thing is, or where exactly it lives in the overall structure of what has been experienced and worked with. The Buddha did not ask him to describe the exchange. He did not ask about the person involved, the nature of what had been said, the circumstances of the encounter, or any of the specific details. The mind organizing itself around a difficult exchange tends to assume are the relevant territory for addressing the difficulty contained in that exchange. He asked the monk something that reoriented the entire frame of the conversation and of the difficulty within it. He asked where the exchange was right now. Where is the exchange right now? The monk understood the question, and the understanding arrived in a form that was direct and concrete, a seeing of something his attention had been systematically moving past for the entire period of the replaying. The exchange was not now. It was not in the present moment of this conversation with the Buddha, which was happening in this specific place, at this specific hour, with this specific quality of light and temperature and sound. It was not in this breath, this room, this morning. It had no presence in any dimension of current experience, except as the object of the mind's current representing of it, a present moment activity, consuming present moment attention and present moment energy, organized entirely around something that had no existence in the present moment itself. The exchange had ended on the day it happened. Everything since had been the mind's relationship to its own representation of a moment that had already, completely and irreversibly finished, and had not been occurring in any dimension of actual experience since the day it finished. The Buddha gave him a verse. It is preserved in a teaching whose title translates directly as the one who has had a single excellent night, a designation that carries, in its quiet understatement, the entire scope of what the teaching points toward. Not enlightenment in any dramatic or final sense. Not an attainment that removes all ordinary human difficulty from the texture of daily experience, or renders the practitioner immune to the returning thought or the residual scent, or the mind's habitual movement toward familiar territory. A single excellent night, one night in which a person genuinely lives the hours they have been given, rather than spending them primarily at temporal addresses that are not where the hours actually are. The verse is brief, and the brevity is itself part of the teaching. Do not chase the past. Do not long for the future. The past is gone. The future has not come. See clearly the phenomenon present in the here and now, unwavering, unshaken, knowing it. Cultivate that. Today, the effort must be made. Who knows? Tomorrow, death may come. 8 sentences, each one doing exactly the work it needs to do without a word more than that work requires, in the manner of teachings that have survived because they contain more than appears at the surface. The past is gone. These 3 words address directly what months of faithful replaying had been costing this monk, and they do this without any weight that would make receiving them feel like accusation or dismissal. The exchange is gone in the specific, literal, unambiguous sense that it is no longer occurring in any dimension of actual experience. This is a statement about time, not a dismissal of significance, or a declaration that what happened did not matter, or that what was felt did not have real content. What happened was real. What was felt was real. The impact on the interior life was real, and continues to organize how things are understood in ways that have nothing to do with whether the moment is actively being replayed in the present. The moment itself, however, ended when it ended and has not been occurring since. The replaying has been occurring since. The original exchange has not. These are 2 categorically different activities, and the teaching draws the distinction between them with a precision that makes the difference impossible to avoid seeing once it has been clearly named and held directly alongside the actual experience of what the replaying has been consuming. The future has not come. The imagined continuations of the relationship, the anticipated encounters, the rehearsed responses to exchanges that might or might not occur in any form, resembling how they have been rehearsed. None of these exist in actual experience. They are constructions assembled in present moment time, from materials available in present moment experience, projected into a dimension of time that has not yet arrived, and may not arrive in the form of the projection regardless of how carefully and thoroughly the projection has been rendered. The mind carrying a difficult history with a specific person tends to generate not only the past dimension of that difficulty, but also the future dimension, imagined scenes of encounter or resolution or continued absence that run alongside the past replaying, consuming their own share of the present moment attention that the past replaying has already significantly reduced. The verse addresses both in adjacent lines because they operate through the same basic mechanism applied in opposite temporal directions, and addressing one without the other leaves the full pattern only partially named. What this leaves is the present moment, the only dimension of time in which actual experience takes place, in which actual life is lived, in which the full quality of being alive in a particular body, in a particular place, at a particular hour, is available in its complete texture, rather than at the thin and divided quality of attention that has been primarily organized around somewhere else. The teaching does not suggest that memory serves no purpose, or that planning for the future is a pathological activity to be abandoned. Both have their proper and functional place in a human life that operates in time. What the verse addresses is the specific and costly pattern of spending the majority of present moment attention at addresses that have no existence in the present moment. The past that is no longer occurring, the future that has not yet arrived, and in particular, the specific past moment that the mind has selected as a permanent address worthy of sustained and regular visitation at the expense of the actual present life that passes through all those hours of visitation without receiving the attention those hours would otherwise have available for the life they contain. The monk received the verse with the quality of attention, available only when something said aloud arrives at a place the listener did not know was waiting for exactly this until the arriving happened. What shifted in him was a precise change in his understanding of where he had been spending his time, and specifically where he had not been spending it. He had not been in his own days, in the way that his own days deserved to be inhabited. He had been in a past day that had ended, returning to it with a consistency and faithfulness that consumed the actual present days that continued to arrive and pass without receiving the attention that those present days contained and offered. What the present days had been experiencing was the remaining attention after the past day had taken its share, which was, over these particular months, not much. Cultivate that. The verse's instruction is the most practical element of the teaching, and what it asks for is specific and immediately available, without preparation or special conditions. The returning to what is actually here, each time the attention moves toward the past address of the exchange, as a concrete and repeatable act, available in any ordinary moment of any ordinary day. The texture of the breath entering and leaving the body right now, the specific temperature of the air, the feeling of it moving through the nostrils, the slight expansion of the chest or belly as the inhale arrives, the gentle settling as the exhale moves through, the physical sensation of whatever surface, temperature, or pressure is in contact with the body in this specific and current moment. the quality of sound present in the actual space where the listening is happening, whatever is actually audible right now, in the actual present room or road or resting place where the hours of this evening are passing. The direct sensory quality of being here, in this actual moment, rather than a concept held about being here. These are available continuously, requiring no special conditions for their availability, ready to receive the attention. In whatever ordinary moment, the attention becomes available to offer itself to them. Each return of attention to what is actually present is also, without any additional effort, a moment in which the past address is not being maintained. The attention cannot simultaneously be fully present in the texture of this specific breath and fully occupied in replaying a moment that has no existence in this breath. Each genuine return to the present, even a brief one, even one followed almost immediately by the mind's departure, again toward the familiar territory of the exchange, provides a genuine moment of the excellent night the teaching's title names as something worth aspiring to. Even a single such moment counts. Each one is evidence, gathered through direct experience, rather than concept, that the present is actually here, that it has a quality worth inhabiting, that the excellent night is available in any moment. The attention arrives genuinely at what is actually present. Now bring this directly into the experience of the person you have been holding through these hours of listening. The living person continues somewhere in the world right now, having the experiences and making the small decisions of a life that has been proceeding since the moment the mind keeps returning to, with all the organic and unrepeatable continuity of a life lived forward in time, without access to any script for where the living is heading. They are not who they were in the moment, frozen in the mind's faithful replication. They have had their own subsequent experiences across the days and months since the moment that constitutes the mind's preferred address, their own encounters that shifted understanding in ways that cannot be tracked from a vantage point located in an earlier moment of their development. The specific configuration of this person that the mind has been holding is a particular arrangement of them at a particular stage of their continuing development. That arrangement has continued rearranging itself through the ordinary passage of lived time, as all living people continue rearranging through the ordinary passage of lived time, without announcement, without reference to how they were configured in any previous arrangement, and without any awareness of being held in a particular prior form inside someone else's mind. And the version of you who was present in that moment has also continued. You are not who you were in the moment. The mind treats as the permanent address of its returning. Everything that has happened since, every experience, every difficult morning, every hour of working with what this journey has offered, every small shift in understanding that arrived through genuine engagement with a genuine difficulty, all of this has been happening to a version of you that continues forward in time, that is not identical to the version who was present in the moment being replayed. The replaying revisits a version of you that no longer exists in that exact form, engaging with a version of them that no longer exists in that exact form, in a moment that no longer exists in any form whatsoever, except as the mind's current representation of it. What is being held with such faithfulness is a kind of historical photograph of two people who have both continued living since the photograph was taken, in directions that the photograph cannot contain or anticipate. There is a quality of loyalty in the replaying that deserves to be named directly, because it is part of why the grip has remained genuinely difficult, even after the construction, the groove, and the residual scent have all been seen clearly. The returning feels, from inside, like a form of faithfulness, like refusing to let what happened diminish to something that simply passes and is forgotten as though it carried no weight. Releasing the replaying can feel like abandoning the significance of the moment, like reducing a real and meaningful experience to something discarded without proper accounting, as though the moment itself will be diminished by no longer being visited, as though the person, or the relationship, or the version of yourself who was genuinely present in what happened will be dishonored by the gradual movement of primary attention back toward the actual present life that has been waiting through all those hours of visitation. The verse's framing addresses this quietly and without argument. Cultivating what is present here is not forgetting, and it is not erasure. It is not a declaration that what happened was unimportant, or that what was felt did not have real content, or that the person was not genuinely significant in the shape of your life. A moment that was genuinely significant leaves its actual mark on who you are through the real changes it produced in your understanding, in your awareness of certain territories of experience, in what you now know that you did not know before. This settling happens through the actual changes that genuine experience produces, and it happens regardless of whether the moment is actively replayed. The replaying has not been the mechanism through which the moment's significance has been honored or preserved. It has been the mechanism through which present moment life has been consumed in an activity organized around a completed event, in a way that the event itself does not require, and that the person in question, wherever they currently are, has no knowledge of and makes no request for. Practitioners who begin genuinely cultivating the return to the present, consistently, across ordinary days, discover the quality of the present moment itself when it receives the primary attention that has been directed elsewhere for an extended period. The difficulty of the returning is real, and the earlier offerings in this journey have given honest tools for working with it. What arrives alongside that difficulty is something the mind organized primarily elsewhere rarely encounters: the texture and richness of the present moment when it actually receives what it has been waiting for. The breath has its own sensory detail, richer than divided attention typically notices. The ordinary fact of being alive in a body in a particular place at a particular hour has a quality of direct presence that attention organized around another temporal address does not fully access. The present moment has been offering this quality continuously through the entire period of the replaying. Each time the attention departed for the past address, the present waited without diminishment, fully available on every return, unchanged in its essential availability, regardless of how extended any particular departure had been. The verse says, "See clearly the phenomenon present in the here and now, unwavering, unshaken, knowing it." Unwavering in the specific sense that the present is always here, regardless of where the attention has been while not here. Its availability does not erode through extended non-use and does not become more vivid through consistent practice. It is simply always fully available to whatever quality of attention arrives at it in any given moment of. Returning, the practice does not create the present moment's availability. It discovers, through the direct experience of returning, rather than through any conceptual understanding of what the present moment offers, that what has been continuously available all along is worth inhabiting, worth returning to, worth treating as the primary address of a life being lived forward in time. The phrase, "Who knows, tomorrow death may come," becomes, with sustained sitting, something considerably more compassionate in its character than it first appears to be. The present moment is the only moment available for the living of the actual life. The past cannot be re-entered, regardless of how much present moment time is organized around representations of it. The future cannot be lived in advance, regardless of how thoroughly it has been rehearsed. What is available is only this, right now, passing through its own texture in the time it takes to pass. The verse's invitation is to receive only this as sufficient for the excellent night it is capable of providing when it is actually inhabited, when the attention that has been spending its hours at other addresses is brought home to where the hours actually are, return to the actual life being lived, rather than to representations of a life that ended at the moment it ended and has not been occurring since. Take a breath here, wherever you are listening from. Feel what is actually present right now in this moment, the physical sensation of listening, the temperature of the air in the space where you are, whatever the body is resting on or against, the sound or silence of the environment around you. This moment, this breath, the life being lived right now, is occurring here, in this specific set of present moment conditions, in this actual hour. The person you have been holding, the living person continuing somewhere in the world, is not in this breath. The frozen version assembled in the mind's construction is not in this breath. What is here is only here, and what the teaching names as excellent is the discovery that only here is sufficient for a genuine night of actual living, when it is actually and genuinely inhabited, rather than merely passed through while the primary attention is organized elsewhere. Even as the grip becomes more workable across the dimensions this journey has addressed, a particular quality of pull tends to remain that the earlier offerings have approached without yet landing on directly. Something in the direction of the person continues orienting experience toward their general territory, even as the specific thought becomes more responsive to method, the scent more spacious through patient witnessing, the present moment more genuinely inhabited through consistent returning. A group of monks encountered this specific quality in a forest where they had gone for a period of intensive practice. They arrived expecting the stillness of an undisturbed environment and found instead a presence they could not name and could not manage through any of the understanding they had brought with them. What they discovered there, through a teaching that came before they had fully understood what they actually needed, is the final medicine this journey has been building toward from its opening breath. There is something the mind does when a thought keeps returning that feels like the natural and appropriate response to something unwanted, making repeated appearances without permission. It pushes back. The returning thought arrives, and the mind contracts around the arrival with a quality of opposition, a tightening toward the presence of something it has already decided it does not want to be hosting. The opposition feels correct. It feels like what the situation requires. When something you have clearly identified as unwanted continues presenting itself with patient indifference to your identification of it as unwanted, the thought keeps coming, so you keep pushing with the kind of firm and consistent resistance that any reasonable person applies to something they have decided they would genuinely prefer not to have occupying the space it keeps occupying. And the thought remains central. This quality of the grip, the way resistance sustains exactly what it is resisting, is what the recognition of the construction, the graduated method for the returning thought, the patient witnessing of the residual scent, and the cultivation of the present moment have each approached without landing on it directly. Those offerings work with how the mind relates to the thought while engaged with it. This final teaching works at the meeting point between the mind and the thought's arrival, at the precise moment when the thought presents itself and something moves to receive it, and it offers the most unexpected medicine of this entire journey, because it asks for the opposite of what every instinct says the situation requires. When what meets the arriving thought is resistance, the grip tightens. Any sustained opposition to something maintains that something as the organizing feature of the opposing mind's experience, keeping it central, keeping it present, keeping the mental furniture arranged around the project of its removal in a way that makes removal the primary activity and the thought the primary object. This is a form of sustained attention that differs from the returning thought primarily in its emotional coloring rather than in the fundamental structure of what it is doing with the presence it opposes. You are still organized around them. The resistance ensures it. A group of monks discovered this with a directness that left no room for comfortable distance from the discovery. They had traveled to a forest at the foot of the Himalayan range to spend their rains retreat, the period each year when wandering practitioners settled in one place for an extended season of focused practice, away from the ordinary movement and social complexity of teaching life. The forest was remote, which was what they wanted. The conditions were materially good, water nearby, shelter adequate, the ordinary logistical concerns of retreat life, manageable without excessive distraction from the practice itself. They arrived with genuine intention, and settled in with the specific quality of hope that accompanies arriving at a place chosen deliberately for what it promises by way of undisturbed internal work. The forest was not undisturbed. It was inhabited by tree spirits, presences that had lived in those trees for longer than anyone could know. In the understanding of the tradition, these were real presences, and the monks experienced them as real, not simply the natural, ambient life of trees and animals and wind moving through branches, but something that oriented itself toward the monk's arrival with its own quality of awareness and its own response to having its home entered without consultation. The presences did not welcome the monks. This was their forest, their dwelling, the territory they had organized their existence around long before the monks' arrival made claims on it. From the perspective of the beings who already lived there, a group of practitioners had simply appeared one day and settled in as though the question of whether they were welcome had not required asking. The manifestation of this unwelcoming arrived in subtle and therefore more exhausting registers than any dramatic opposition would have produced. Disturbances in the night, not definable sounds, but a quality of the darkness that prevented the settling into stillness that deep practice requires. A presence at the edges of the monk's awareness that produced a low and continuous alertness, incompatible with the depth of concentration their retreat was designed to cultivate. Appearances at the periphery of vision that resolved into nothing definable when looked at directly, producing a particular and draining quality of unease in the body, the sustained activation of some basic alerting mechanism that had concluded the environment required more vigilance than could be maintained, alongside genuine meditative work. They could not settle into what they had come to develop. They could not sleep deeply enough to support the practice. The concentration their retreat had been established to deepen was continuously fractured by the management of what was present in the forest alongside them, monitoring it, tracking it at the edges of awareness, maintaining a readiness against further incursion into the settled space they were attempting to establish and could not fully establish because the presences kept the edges of that space permanently uncertain. The monks were working hard at managing something that responded to management by remaining exactly as present and exactly as disruptive as it had been before the management began. After weeks of this, they returned to the Buddha and described the situation plainly: the forest, its inhabitants, the specific and consistent ways the presences had prevented the kind of practice the retreat had been designed to support. They had tried the tools available to them and arrived at the limits of those tools without resolution. They asked what to do with the honesty of people who have worked genuinely and need to acknowledge that genuine work has not been sufficient for what they are facing. The Buddha's response was not what any of them expected. He did not tell them to find a different forest. He did not offer a method for neutralizing the presences, eliminating their effect on the monk's experience, or creating protected conditions within which the practice could proceed without reference to what was present in the surrounding trees. He did not suggest that intensification of the approaches the monks had already tried would eventually reach what those approaches had not yet reached. He sent them back with a practice. As they walked back into that forest, and as they settled for meditation each evening, and as they woke in the nights when the presences made themselves felt, they were to send those presences genuine goodwill, not as a technique designed to produce the specific outcome of the presences becoming less disruptive, not as a strategic gesture toward beings they privately continued to regard as obstacles to what they had come to the forest to accomplish, as a genuine wish, freely extended to beings who existed in that forest, with their own form of life, and their own relationship to what the forest meant, and their own responses to having that relationship disrupted by arrivals who had given them no notice and sought no permission from the lives already being lived in that place. The specific phrases the tradition preserves from this practice are gathered in a text called the Karaniya Metta Sutta, taught to these monks for this specific situation in a specific forest, and carried forward across 25 centuries, because what it addresses is not specific to a forest or a season of practice in a particular location under particular circumstances. What it addresses is the fundamental question of what the mind does when it encounters a presence it has decided it does not want, and what becomes genuinely available when that fundamental stance toward the presence changes. May all beings be happy. May they be safe from danger. May they be healthy and strong. May they live with ease. These phrases move outward from the mind that generates them, first to oneself, then to those who are easy to love, then to those who are neutral, then to the difficult, then to all beings without exception in any direction. The difficult category is where the monk's experience with the tree spirits lives, and where your experience with the person you cannot release lives also. The practice asks specifically for goodwill toward the difficult, because the mind's relationship to the difficult fundamentally changes when it stops meeting difficulty with opposition and begins meeting it with something that requires no defending, no effortful sustaining, and no organizing of the interior space around the project of the difficult presence's removal. The monks returned to the forest. They began generating goodwill toward the presences as they re-entered the trees, toward beings they had been monitoring and managing and opposing through weeks of exhausting vigilance. The initial quality of the generating was not what the practice's phrases describe as their destination. Goodwill directed towards something that has been disrupting your sleep and undermining your practice for weeks will carry the texture of the previous weeks in it, at least in the beginning. The practice does not require the goodwill to be pure before it is offered. It requires that it be genuinely intended, that the directing of it represents an actual willingness to wish well to the being toward whom it is directed, in whatever quality that wishing is currently capable of in its early and imperfect form. Something shifted in the forest. The tradition records the tree spirit's response with a directness that it does not treat as metaphor. The presences received the goodwill being directed toward them and were moved by it in the specific sense that genuine goodwill directed toward a being by another being with real intention changes something in the quality of the relationship between them that was not changed before the directing began. The presences that had been organizing the monk's experience of the forest as unwelcoming territory began to organize it differently. The tree spirits became, the tradition records, protective, not because their fundamental nature changed, but because what was being directed toward them changed what the relationship between them and the monks was, which changed what their response to the monk's presence could be. The monks slept. They practiced without the continuous fractioning of concentration that the management of hostile presences had required. The retreat produced what retreats are capable of producing when the conditions for practice are genuinely stable, a deepening of the qualities the practice had been working toward through weeks that the presence's disruption had made impossible. Nothing about the forest changed in any material respect. The trees stood where they had always stood. The spirits remained in their dwelling place, as they had remained through every previous day and night of the retreat. What changed was what the monks were bringing to the encounter, which changed what the encounter was, which changed everything that depended on the quality of that encounter being something other than adversarial. Now bring this directly into the territory this journey has been working within. The thought of this person arrives in the mind. It arrives with whatever quality it characteristically carries. The specific texture of this particular person's presence in the mind's interior space, the emotional register that thinking of them produces, the characteristic pull toward the construction this journey has named and examined closely. And something meets it. Something was always meeting it. Across every arrival since the grip established itself, and that something has been doing most of the work that has kept the grip organized and sustained through all the months or years of its duration. What has been meeting it is most likely a version of resistance. The thought is unwanted, and so what meets it is a contraction, a pushing away that feels like what the situation requires, like what self-respect asks for, like it is doing something purposeful about the presence, rather than simply receiving it. The pushing is genuine, and the motivation behind it is real, and the wish for this thought to no longer organize so much of the interior life is completely reasonable and fully justified by everything the grip has cost. And the pushing keeps them central. The mind organized around expelling something is organized around that something in the most complete sense available. The thing being expelled defines the organizing principle of the expulsion, which means it defines the organizing principle of the mind engaged in expelling it, which means removing it from the center of attention through expulsion is structurally prevented by the act of expulsion itself, which places it at the center and then pushes outward from that center, guaranteeing that the center remains occupied by exactly what the pushing is trying to remove. The tree spirits remained disruptive through weeks of the monks' vigilance and management, not because the monks lacked genuine commitment to their practice, but because vigilance and management are forms of sustained engagement with what is being vigilantly managed, and sustained engagement keeps what is engaged with present, regardless of the emotional quality of the engagement. The practice the Buddha offered changes what meets the thought's arrival. When the thought of this person arrives and what meets it is genuine goodwill, may you be happy, may you be at ease, may you be free from whatever suffering your current life contains. The mind's relationship to the arrival is fundamentally different from what it is when opposition meets it. Goodwill does not organize itself around the project of the thought's removal. It meets the arrival with something that contains no fighting, no contracting, no ongoing arrangement of the interior space around the management of what keeps arriving. And in the absence of that fighting and contracting, the thought finds nothing to sustain itself against, because part of what sustains the returning thought across time is the very structure of organized opposition that has been consistently there to meet it. This lands with some resistance at first, and that resistance is worth naming clearly. The instruction to send goodwill towards someone whose presence in the mind has been a source of genuine suffering can feel like capitulation, like being asked to pretend that what happened carried no weight, to offer something unearned, to perform a generosity that the actual history between you and this person does not support and has not earned. The practice asks for none of this. It does not ask you to approve of what happened or simplify what the relationship actually was or was not. It asks for goodwill directed toward a being who suffers, as all beings suffer, in their own forms and through their own interior entanglements, because that shared condition is the ground on which genuine goodwill rests, entirely independent of any particular history between the one offering it and the one toward whom it is offered. The person you cannot release is suffering in some form right now. You do not know the specific form because you do not have access to their current life, except through the construction the mind has built from prior knowledge of an earlier version of them. The general fact of their suffering requires no specific knowledge to affirm. They are a human being living a human life, which means they encounter fear and loss and disappointment and the difficulty of being alive in circumstances that do not consistently cooperate with what is hoped for. Wishing them well in that suffering, genuinely, without requiring them to have earned the wishing through any demonstrated recognition of what you have been carrying, is the ground the practice stands on and returns to on every occasion of its offering. May you be happy. May you be safe from the particular dangers your own life presents to you right now. May you be healthy and strong. May you live with ease. These phrases directed toward this specific person who has occupied so much interior space do not require you to have resolved everything that their presence in that space represents. They do not require forgiveness as a completed act, or acceptance as a finished condition, or peace as a state already fully established before the practice can begin. They require the genuine intention to wish well to a being who suffers as you suffer, in whatever quality that intention is capable of, in its current and still developing form. The monks practicing in the forest did not immediately feel warm toward presences that had been disrupting their sleep for weeks. The practice does not promise warmth as its first product. It offers the genuine intention as the practice itself and allows whatever quality of genuine feeling develops through consistent offering to arrive at its own pace through the practice, rather than being required in advance as a prerequisite for beginning. The consistency of the offering across actual occasions when the thought arrives is what allows the practice to develop toward its fuller quality over real time. Each occasion of offering, each thought met with the intention of goodwill rather than the habitual contraction of resistance, is one instance of re-entering the forest and extending the practice toward the presences who inhabit it. The relationship changes through the accumulation of those instances, not through a single instance of sufficient emotional intensity that resolves everything in one dramatic movement. What the monks found across the days of the practice was that their experience of the environment changed without the environment's objective features changing in any material respect. The forest remained what it had always been. The presences remained in their trees. What changed was the quality of the meeting between the monks and the forest's other inhabitants, which changed what the encounter was, which changed what the experience of being in that forest was, which changed everything that depended on those conditions being stable enough for the practice to actually proceed. The presences that had been the source of disruption became, through the change in what the monks were bringing to the encounter, something that no longer disrupted. The forest did not change. What was brought into it changed, and that change was sufficient to change everything. The thought of this person will continue to arrive. The practice does not promise that it will stop arriving, or that the arriving will become consistently comfortable, or that the history between you and this person will be simplified into something tidier than what it actually has been. What it offers is more modest and more real, that what meets the arriving can change, that the relationship between your mind and this person's presence in it is not permanently fixed by the history that established the presence, however long that history extends, that the meeting point, the precise moment when the thought presents itself and something moves to receive it, is where the possibility of genuine release actually lives, because release happens not when the thought is expelled through sufficient force of will, but when what meets the thought no longer feeds the grip that has been sustaining itself, partly through the energy of the opposition directed at it. The tree spirits in that Himalayan forest did not change their nature. They were what they had always been, presences with their own form of awareness, their own relationship to the territory they inhabited, their own responses to what arrived in that territory without consultation. The monks did not eliminate them, did not defeat them, did not neutralize them through any technique designed to make them less present or less real. The monks changed what they were bringing to the encounter, and that change was what the entire situation had been waiting for, not from the side of the presences, but from the side of the monks themselves. What could be changed? They changed, and the changing of what was available to be changed changed everything else that had seemed immovable. That same movement is available in any ordinary moment when the thought of this person arrives. You do not need to wait for the grip to have weakened further before beginning this practice. You do not need the history to have been processed more completely or the hurt to have diminished to a more manageable level before the offering of goodwill becomes something you have the capacity to attempt. You attempt it now, in whatever form is genuinely available now, with the honest acknowledgement that now is where the practice begins, rather than at some future point when conditions are more favorable for beginning it. May you be happy. This is the final medicine this journey has been building toward from its opening breath. It is also the most surprising because it does not require the thought to be gone, does not require the person to have changed, does not require the history between you to be different from what it is. It requires only that what meets the thought when it arrives changes from the opposition that has been keeping the grip organized around the thought's removal to a genuine wish directed toward a being who suffers as you suffer without any requirement that they have earned the wish through any particular recognition of what you have been carrying through the months or years of the grip's duration. Take a breath here, wherever you are listening from. The journey has moved through 5 distinct understandings of why the grip persists and what the Dhamma offers in response to each layer of that persistence. A construction maintained by your own returning attention, seen clearly enough that the maintenance itself becomes visible. A groove met with graduated and patient method that acknowledges the returning as a feature of conditioning rather than a failure of will. A residual scent in the fabric of identity witnessed with unhurried, non-forcing presence until the natural clearing the witnessing allows can proceed at its own pace. A past moment seen as past, genuinely and completely past, so that the present can be inhabited as the only place where actual life, actual release, and actual peace are real and available. And now this. The meeting point changed from resistance to goodwill, with effects on what the grip can sustain. That resistance alone would never have produced, regardless of how sustained or how earnest the resistance. All 5 of these are available to you in any ordinary moment, without special conditions, and without requiring you to be further along than you currently are. The releasing they point toward is not a destination that must be reached completely before anything of value has occurred. It is happening in real time, in each ordinary moment, when one of these understandings is genuinely brought to where the grip lives and what the grip is doing. Each moment of clear seeing, each graduated response to the returning thought, each instance of patient witnessing, each genuine return to what is actually present, each 4 phrases of goodwill directed toward the person whose thought arrives without permission. Each of these is the releasing, occurring incrementally in the actual hours of an actual life being lived forward through whatever comes next. Something becomes available when all 5 of these understandings have been genuinely inhabited rather than merely received, something quieter than any of the 5 teachings individually. That tends to arrive not as a dramatic shift, but as a gradual change in the overall texture of interior life, the way the quality of a room changes when a window that has been closed for a long time is finally opened, and the air that enters is simply the ordinary air outside, which has been there all along, waiting without urgency for the window to become available to it. What that quality is, and what the tradition says about the life that becomes possible once the grip has genuinely and progressively released its hold, is where this journey arrives next. There is a man who descended a bamboo pole in an ancient village marketplace and arrived, for the first time in 11 years, exactly where he was standing. You have traveled the same distance tonight, through different territory, but toward the same arrival. The grip was never simple, and this journey honored that. You saw what you were actually holding and what it was made of. You found 5 ways to work with the thought that returned regardless of understanding. You sat with the scent that outlasted the washing and gave it the patient witnessing it had always required. You saw the frozen image for what it was, 2 people who had continued living and returned to the only moment where actual life occurs. And you discovered that what meets the thought matters more than how hard you push against it. The Buddha's verse arrives here one more time, gently, as it was always meant to be received. Do not chase the past. Do not long for the future. The past is gone. The future has not come. See clearly the phenomenon present in the here and now, unwavering, unshaken, knowing it. Cultivate that. Wherever you are listening from tonight, whatever room, whatever city, whatever quiet hour this has found you in, you are not alone in having loved someone who took up residence in your mind. That is simply what significant people do. The breath arriving right now is yours, completely, without anyone else in it.